Hello and welcome, friends, especially to those of you who value faith, freedom, and the courage to stand when it's easier to stay silent. You're in the right place. Today's story isn't just powerful, it's necessary. What started with a $500 0-cents fine in a Southern courtroom became a national firestorm for justice, truth, and constitutional rights. If you've ever felt your voice didn't matter, this story will remind you otherwise. So sit back, open your heart, and witness how one woman's quiet conviction shook the legal system to its core. You won't forget what's about to unfold. Let's begin. The courtroom was quiet, but the insult echoed like a cannon through the South. At the Liberty Court complex in Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss hung like judgment from old oaks, Karoline Leavitt stood at the rear of the chamber, her posture straight, her silver cross glinting softly against her navy blazer. Judge Raymond Coulter, presiding over a public prayer case, paused mid-session to address her directly. His voice was sharp, dismissive. "This is a federal courtroom, Miss Leavitt. Religious relics have no place here." Then came the gavel, and with it, the fine $500 0-cents for what he called a symbolic provocation. The room stirred. Journalists took note. Cameras blinked. But Karoline didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out, not in retreat, but in quiet preparation. Outside the courthouse, under a hot southern sky, reporters swarmed, but she offered only 5 words: "I'll see him in court." That night, inside the modest southern outpost of the White House press office, she watched the clip back with cold clarity. It wasn't about her cross. It was about the message, the arrogance, the precedent. And so she picked up the phone and called Riley Ashford. The words came out calm, measured, but electric. "We're filing a lawsuit. I want him to answer for that gavel. $800 million worth." Across the South, and soon across the country, the message spread. This wasn't about a fine. It was about a reckoning, and it had just begun. Karoline Leavitt didn't sleep the night after the fine. The $500 0-cents receipt sat on her desk like a scar, still warm from the courtroom printer. At the southern outpost of the White House Press Bureau in Savannah, she sat alone in the early hours, her cross still resting against her collarbone, untouched. She replayed the courtroom audio again and again, Judge Coulter's voice clipped and scornful. "Symbols of superstition have no place here." It wasn't just the insult. It was the message behind it. A federal judge, sworn to uphold the Constitution, had publicly demeaned an American citizen for quietly wearing her faith. And not just any citizen. She was the White House press secretary, representing millions. But Coulter didn't care. That's what made it worse. At 7:00 IM sharp, Riley Ashford walked in. Hair pulled into a no-nonsense knot, suit slightly wrinkled from the overnight train. She didn't wait for coffee. Riley had prosecuted corrupt mayors, exposed judicial bribery, and never lost a First Amendment case in Georgia. Karoline slid the fine across the table. "I want blood," she said, not with anger but precision. Riley reviewed the fine, then the transcript, then Coulter's judicial record. Her expression hardened. "He's done this before," she said, flipping through files she'd pre-pulled. "Prayer pins, crosses, headscarves. Always called them distractions." Karoline leaned forward. "So we go after him?" Riley didn't blink. "We don't appeal. We sue. Defamation, violation of religious freedom, federal overreach." She tapped the table twice. $800 million, 0 cents. The number hung in the air like a thundercloud. Karoline nodded. "Then we'll make it rain." Outside the courthouse, cameras still waited. Inside her office, the fire was lit. By the end of the week, every newsroom in America would know the youngest press secretary in U.S. history was going to war. Not with words, but with the Constitution. By Monday morning, the strategy was no longer theoretical, it was operational. Riley Ashford had transformed her Savannah legal office into a war room. Stacks of binders, digital transcripts, and judicial records littered the long oak table at the center, all pointing toward a single target, Judge Raymond Coulter. While the media fixated on the $800 million 0 cents figure, Riley knew the lawsuit had to be more than a headline. It had to be airtight. That's when the door opened and in walked Della Crane, quiet, composed, and clutching a leather-bound notebook. A 27-year veteran court clerk with a photographic memory, Della had seen more behind-the-scenes corruption than most district attorneys. She sat down and slid the notebook across the table without a word. Inside were 10 years of handwritten notations, each case where Coulter fined, reprimanded, or advised litigants and observers for wearing religious symbols in his courtroom, a cross necklace here, a prayer pin there, even a Muslim woman who had been warned for adjusting her hijab. The tally was staggering. 240 incidents, 85% involved Christians. Riley flipped through the pages in silence. "This is gold," she muttered, eyes hardening. "This isn't enforcement, it's targeting." Della hesitated, then added, "He laughed at vulgar shirts, but found rosaries too suggestive." Riley nodded and scanned the data. "We'll call it the Southern Record." They began digitizing the notebook immediately, turning every incident into a data point, every data point into a timeline. Meanwhile, Noah Vance, Karoline's media strategist, launched the narrative. His voice echoed down the hallway as he coordinated with content creators and journalists. "We're not spinning anything, we're exposing everything." The hashtag Coulter on Trial was born, first with subtle infographics, then a sledgehammer, a photo collage of 12 fined courtroom observers, including a Vietnam veteran whose flag pin had been labeled "partisan distraction." Back at the White House regional office, Karoline watched the social graph spike, 20,000 mentions in under an hour. She sat in front of a tablet, reading messages pouring in from veterans, pastors, and mothers. "He fined my daughter for a purity ring. I wore a crucifix in that courtroom. I was told to tuck it in." We weren't imagining it. He was targeting us. Karoline closed her eyes and whispered, "So we make it visible." She dialed Riley. "Add Coulter's media comments to the record. That superstition line, make it evidence." Riley already had. She was one step ahead. At 3:00 p.m., Riley filed the lawsuit in federal court, Leavitt v. Coulter et al. The damages requested, $800 million 0 cents. The basis, defamation, religious discrimination, violation of First Amendment rights under color of federal authority, and emotional harm stemming from targeted systemic bias. But in bold, just under the header, a single sentence read, "This suit is not about money, it is about message, memory, and moral redress." By nightfall, the media was ablaze. Newsmax broke the story first, Fox News followed, CNN ridiculed it as political theater, but the southern states paid attention. County by county, viewers saw the pattern. One judge, one bias, one woman standing against it all. In a quiet moment before the next press call, Karoline sat with the original $500 0 cents receipt framed on her desk. "That man thought he could fine me into silence," she said aloud. "He just bought a front-row seat to his own downfall." Across town, in his chambers, Judge Coulter watched the coverage unfold with a forced grin and a tightening throat. The courthouse buzzed with whispers. Emails were being searched, recordings were being recovered. The walls were closing in, and in the eye of the storm stood Karoline Leavitt, cross visible, voice steady, and the law fully behind her. The courthouse air was already thick with tension when the first leak hit Riley Ashford's inbox. An encrypted email dump marked only with the subject line, "You need to see this." It was from Wyatt Kelly, an unassuming IT staffer at the Liberty Court Complex, known for his quiet demeanor and impeccable digital discipline. What he uncovered wasn't just judicial misconduct, it was a political powder keg. The files included a series of emails and encrypted messages between Judge Raymond Coulter and Senator Owen Kessler, a powerful anti-Trump figurehead from California. The language was blunt, unmistakable. Target Leavitt, break her on the faith front, discredit her, and Trump falters. The implications were seismic. This wasn't a rogue judge acting on personal bias. This was an orchestrated effort to weaponize the judiciary against a federal official, to cripple a sitting administration's moral base. Riley read every line twice before forwarding it to Karoline and Miriam Espinoza, the federal investigator from the Department of Judicial Oversight now assigned to the Coulter case. Miriam didn't need convincing. She had seen enough in her 20-year career to know when a judge crossed the line. But this wasn't crossing, it was erasure. "This isn't misconduct," she said during a closed-call briefing. "This is collusion." She initiated an emergency request to secure Coulter's digital devices and server access, but Wyatt had already saved local copies, anticipating a cover-up. "He's going to try and delete everything," Wyatt warned, but the systems already preserved it. Meanwhile, Noah Vance got to work. The leaks were sensitive, too explosive to be dumped all at once, so he opted for a strategic release. The first wave included screenshots of the most damning messages and a voiceover video featuring the message, "Faith is her weakness? Not in this America." The clip hit Twitter, now X, at 6:00 p.m. sharp. Within 3 hours, Coulter on trial surpassed 50,000 mentions. TikTok and YouTube creators began reenacting the courtroom scene. A retired Marine filmed himself reading the leaked messages aloud with the caption, "This is why we fought, so they couldn't do this back home." For older Americans, especially veterans, the betrayal was visceral. They'd served to protect the very rights now being trampled in a Georgia courtroom. At the White House regional office, Karoline Leavitt sat quietly, scrolling through the growing flood of testimonials. A former nurse, a coal worker, a retired school teacher, all had been dismissed, fined, or silenced for their expressions of faith in public spaces, and they saw their story in hers. She tapped a note into her tablet. "This isn't about one courtroom. This is about every person they tried to erase." Then she called Riley. "We release the full transcript tomorrow. Let them see the strings. Let them see who is pulling them." Miriam, now working alongside a forensic digital team, uncovered even more disturbing evidence. Encrypted conversations between Coulter and Helena Brown, his fellow judge and longtime ally. Brown had encouraged him to pursue the case aggressively, describing Karoline as the golden domino. "Tip her and the rest will fall." These weren't judges preserving impartiality, they were tacticians using courtrooms as ideological battlegrounds. At 9:00 a.m. the next day, Karoline held a press briefing on the courthouse steps. No teleprompter, no flash. Just her voice, clear and composed. "This court fined me for a cross, but it was never about jewelry. It was about removing people like me, and you, from spaces of influence. I will not be erased, and neither will our faith." She held up a printout of the Coulter-Kessler email, "Target Leavitt. Undermine the base." The media frenzy was immediate. Fox News ran the headline, "Judge Caught in Political Plot Against White House." Newsmax called it a judicial coup attempt. Even CNN, though cautious, ran with, "Federal Judge Under Fire for Political Coordination." Inside his chambers, Coulter watched in horror as the email thread dominated every news cycle. He called Kessler, no answer. He texted Brown, no reply. The circle was collapsing, and for the first time in his career, the gavel no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a spotlight. Karoline Leavitt had pulled the curtain back. The puppet strings were visible, and the hands holding them were now exposed. If Judge Coulter thought the legal battle would be confined to the courtroom, he'd severely underestimated the battlefield. As his office scrambled to control the fallout from the leaked emails, Karoline's team launched a precision strike, not in person, but online. At the center of this digital offensive was Noah Vance, a former Navy cyber intelligence officer turned political media strategist who understood two things better than anyone: timing and message control. Sitting in a minimalist studio in Savannah, he coordinated a digital campaign like a military op. "This isn't a meme war," he told his team. "This is information warfare with constitutional stakes." His first move was releasing a slow-motion clip of Karoline standing before the courtroom, cross-visible, her voice defiant. "You tried to find my faith, now you'll face the truth." Overlaid text read, "Coulter on trial." Within hours, the video exploded across social media platforms. Veterans posted response videos. Pastors held prayer vigils and streamed them live. A machinist from Kentucky uploaded a TikTok simply showing his calloused hands holding a cross, saying, "If this offends a judge, what country am I in?" The clip got over 1 million views. But Noah didn't stop there. He deployed what he called credibility anchors, short testimonial videos featuring retired teachers, first responders, and military men, each telling their stories of being silenced for their faith in public. They weren't flashy, they didn't need to be, they were real. That's what made them viral. Cable news quickly picked up on the movement. Fox News devoted an entire segment to the Coulter on trial campaign. Newsmax interviewed Karoline live, framing her as the steel spine of free speech. Even moderate outlets couldn't ignore the wildfire. As the clips gained traction, something unusual happened. Mainstream ridicule gave way to quiet concern. The numbers didn't lie. NOAA's media dashboard showed the hashtag hit 200,000 mentions in under 48 hours. But more importantly, the sentiment was 87% positive across men aged 50 and up, a demographic typically cautious about viral movements. Karoline wasn't just trending, she was resonating. From her press office, Karoline monitored the dashboard quietly. She wasn't interested in going viral for vanity. Every share, every video, every post was part of the case. Public support, public testimony, public outrage. We're not weaponizing faith, she told NOAA. We're defending its place in public life. And with each passing hour, Judge Coulter's image shifted from authoritative to authoritarian. The digital tide had turned, and the courtroom wasn't the only place where justice was being served. In homes, on phones, in living rooms across America, people were watching and choosing sides. And Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a press secretary. She had become a symbol, a movement, a line in the digital sand. The morning of the trial's opening arguments, the Liberty Court complex pulsed with tension. Protesters gathered outside the wrought iron gates, veterans in old service jackets standing shoulder to shoulder with pastors in plain black robes, all clutching handmade signs, reading, "Faith is not a crime," and "Coulter on trial." Inside, the marble halls echoed with the shuffling of reporters, legal clerks, and observers who had traveled from across the state just to witness what many were calling the most consequential First Amendment case in a generation. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, calm, composed, her silver cross pinned proudly to her blazer. This wasn't a press briefing. It wasn't a campaign speech. It was a reckoning, and she had come prepared. Judge Amelia Ruiz, a woman known for her stern temperament and spotless record, presided over the federal bench. She opened with a sharp bang of the gavel and a warning, "This courtroom is not a theater, it is a chamber of truth." Then she turned it over to the plaintiff's counsel, Riley Ashford. The Southern firebrand stood with conviction and began her assault with what she called the Southern Record, a visual timeline of 240 separate cases where Judge Raymond Coulter had fined, warned, or rebuked citizens for wearing religious symbols. One by one, images appeared on the court projector. A teenage girl fined for a rosary bracelet, a pastor reprimanded for a cross lapel pin, a Muslim woman told her headscarf was disruptive. 85% were Christian, but the pattern of bias was unmistakable. Riley's voice never rose. She didn't need drama, she had facts. Next came the testimony of Grant Monroe, a retired Marine who now worked as a courthouse security officer. Dressed in his uniform blues, he stood tall and unwavering as he recounted multiple occasions where Coulter selectively enforced decorum rules. "I've watched him let men in with shirts reading 'God is dead,' but he fined a mother who wore a cross necklace after her son's funeral," Grant said. The gallery audibly gasped. Ruiz let the silence linger before gesturing for the next witness. Della Crane took the stand next, her hands visibly shaking as she held her leather-bound notebook. "I've kept records on every ruling," she explained. "I wasn't sure anyone would care until now." She flipped page after page describing in meticulous detail how Coulter would hold religious people to a different standard than anyone else. He once allowed a defendant to testify in a t-shirt that said, "F the world," but fined a woman for a small gold cross earring. I wrote it all down. Her voice broke slightly. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Karoline gave her a slight nod from the plaintiff's table. A silent thank you. But it was Karoline's testimony that brought the courtroom to a standstill. She rose from her seat, crossed the room with deliberate grace, and took the stand. Riley asked only one question: "Why did you wear the cross that day?" Karoline looked at the judge, then the jury. "Because it's not a symbol of politics, it's a symbol of my faith. The very kind of expression this Constitution was written to protect. Judge Coulter didn't find me for breaking a rule, he fined me to make a statement, to send a message that people like me don't belong in public service unless we conform. That's not justice, that's coercion." Her words were quiet, but thunderous in impact. Even the court stenographer paused for a beat. Then came the final blow. Riley called Wyatt Kelly, the IT staffer, who authenticated the encrypted emails between Judge Coulter and Senator Owen Kessler. One message stood out and was read aloud in full. "Leavitt is the key, target her cross, undermine her integrity, and the right's moral center begins to collapse." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Ruiz's face hardened. Riley turned to the courtroom. They didn't just attack her, they tried to weaponize the bench. Karoline's cross shimmered under the courtroom lighting as she returned to her seat. She glanced at Coulter, who had begun sweating visibly, his collar tight around his neck. For years he had ruled from a position of absolute authority, untouchable behind a gavel and tradition. But today, that power was bleeding out under the weight of evidence, truth, and courage. Ruiz adjourned the day's session with a curt nod. "This court reconvenes at 9:00 a.m. We proceed to judgment soon." Outside, the crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in resolve. They didn't chant slogans, they sang hymns. The steps of the courthouse became an altar of solidarity. And in that rising chorus of voices, one thing was clear. This trial wasn't just about one fine, one judge, or even one cross. It was about who gets to stand in the public square and still hold on to what they believe. And for the first time in a long time, millions of Americans watching from afar saw something they recognized: honor on the witness stand. The courtroom's air had shifted. What began as a legal dispute now crackled with something heavier: inevitability. Judge Coulter, once the symbol of unwavering authority, now sat slumped behind the defense table, eyes sunken, fingers twitching near his collar as though it might loosen the tightening scrutiny, and it was about to get worse. Helena Brown, Coulter's longtime ally on the bench and a respected voice in Georgia's judicial circles, was called to testify. Her silver bun and stiff blazer couldn't hide the tension in her eyes. Under oath, she tried to remain composed, offering vague justifications for Coulter's actions, terms like courtroom discretion, symbolic neutrality, and security tone. But Riley Ashford wasn't interested in euphemisms. She projected a message Helena had sent Coulter 2 months before Karoline's fine: use the decorum rule, get her cross off camera. Hitting her faith fractures the base. The courtroom gasped. Brown stammered. It wasn't strategy, it was a private concern. But Riley pressed. So you conspired with another judge to suppress the First Amendment rights of a federal official because you disagreed with her politics? Helena faltered, her voice barely above a whisper. We thought we'd succeed. Judge Ruiz's eyes narrowed. Let the record reflect that acknowledgement, she said, her gavel cracking through the silence. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Miriam Espinoza and her DOJ investigative team completed their forensic analysis of Coulter's deleted server files. What they found was damning. Dozens of redacted communications with Owen Kessler via an encrypted messaging app, including one written on the night before Karoline's fine. She's too visible. Hit her now while media's distracted with the finance bill. This is our shot. They also uncovered a hastily scribbled note left in Coulter's desk drawer that read, "Push her out quietly. Make the cross the issue. Public won't know what hit her." The note was entered into evidence and projected in front of the courtroom. Ruiz called for silence and looked directly at Coulter. Judge Coulter, do you deny authoring this? He didn't speak. He simply lowered his head. At that moment, the robe no longer represented justice. It was a mask, and it had fallen. Reporters furiously typed, spectators whispered with urgency. But Karoline remained still, dignified, unshaken. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. Her strength wasn't in her outrage. It was in her restraint. Riley called her final witness, Miriam Espinoza. The seasoned investigator took the stand with authority and precision. She laid out the timeline, the cover-up attempt, and the pattern of abuse. "What we're seeing here isn't a lapse in judgment," she said. "It's a deliberate pattern of discrimination masked as policy." She paused. "And when the courts become ideological weapons, the entire republic trembles." The statement reverberated. Ruiz nodded slowly. "This trial has revealed not just misconduct, but betrayal of public trust." Then she recessed the court for deliberation. Outside, a crowd of hundreds now swelled into the streets. Bells from a nearby church rang, and somewhere beneath the roar of traffic, a quiet chant began to rise: "Truth will stand." The public didn't need a verdict yet. They already knew what had collapsed. The robe was just fabric. The law, they had rediscovered, was flesh and blood, and today it belonged to the people again. When court reconvened the next morning, a sense of finality lingered like morning fog over Liberty Court. The pews were packed. Pastors, veterans, teachers, fathers and mothers all sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting not just for a verdict, but for a signal that truth still mattered in America. Judge Emilia Ruiz entered with a stony expression, the kind that carried weight not because of theatrics, but because of discipline. She wasted no time. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff," she declared, her voice clear and firm. "The court further awards $800 million, 0 cents in damages to Miss Karoline Leavitt for defamation, First Amendment violations, and targeted religious discrimination conducted under federal authority." A collective exhale moved through the gallery, followed by a burst of stunned applause, but Ruiz wasn't finished. "This court also orders the immediate implementation of structural reforms within the Liberty Court complex and the broader Southern Circuit," she continued. "These include mandatory First Amendment retraining for all federal judges within the circuit, the prohibition of fines or punishments based on the wearing of religious symbols unless tied to a clear and present disruption, and an independent oversight committee to be led by DOJ agent Miriam Espinoza." Gasps gave way to murmurs of relief. The verdict wasn't just punitive, it was corrective. As reporters scrambled to tweet, post, and broadcast the historic ruling, Karoline remained seated, her gaze fixed ahead, fingers gently holding the silver cross that had sparked it all. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a moment of closure. Riley Ashford placed a quiet hand on her shoulder. "You didn't just win," she said softly. "You rewrote the rules." Across the aisle, Coulter sat frozen. His once imposing figure looked small beneath the black robe that now felt like a disguise stripped away by truth. In her final statement, Ruiz addressed the courtroom and the cameras that broadcasted live across the country. "Faith is not fanaticism. Expression is not disruption, and the courtroom should never be used to silence either. Today, we reaffirm that justice must be neutral, not neutered." Her gavel slammed down with a sharp finality, and just like that, the trial was over. But the movement had only just begun. Outside, the steps of Liberty Court became sacred ground. A veteran knelt and prayed, a mother held her child close, and above it all, a banner unfurled from a church steeple across the street. It read, "Truth will stand." Karoline stepped out beneath the Georgia sun, not as a press secretary, not as a public figure, but as the symbol of something far larger. That one voice, when armed with conviction and courage, could make a courtroom tremble and a nation take notice. A week after the verdict, the crowd gathered in the heart of Savannah's Liberty Park felt less like a political rally and more like a quiet homecoming. The breeze was light, the sun filtered through the trees, and in the shadow of the same courthouse where the trial had unfolded, a new kind of stage had been built. At its center stood Karoline Leavitt, not behind a press podium but in front of a wooden platform, no teleprompter, no secret service, just her, a microphone, and the people. Veterans stood at attention beside faith leaders in modest robes, retired steel workers from Georgia, coal miners from West Virginia, and truckers from Alabama held signs that read, "Faith is freedom, and we are all witnesses." Families brought lawn chairs, church choirs warmed up under tents. It was more than an event, It was a reclamation. Liberty Park, once the center of a controversial ban on public prayer that sparked protests years ago, had been reborn. Today, Karoline was invited not by politicians, but by pastors and veterans to speak as a citizen who had fought for them all. The crowd quieted as she stepped forward. She wore no suit jacket, just a silver blouse, the silver cross still glinting at her neckline. "This is the place," she began, "where they said faith should stay silent, where crosses were disruptive and prayer was unnecessary, but you stood anyway, and because you stood, so did I." Her voice didn't tremble, it rang. She told the story again, this time not as a witness in a courtroom but as someone handing the microphone to the people. She spoke of Della Crane's courage, of Wyatt Kelly's integrity, of Grant Monroe's loyalty. "They didn't sign up for fame. They showed up for truth," she said. "They weren't loud, they were faithful." Her words were met with nods, tears, and murmurs of amen. Then she held up the framed copy of her $500 0-cent fine, now cracked along the corner. "This is what they gave me for wearing a cross," she said, pausing. "And this is what we gave them back. $800 million, 0 cents in truth, and a reformed court." In the front row, a Vietnam veteran in full uniform saluted. A young girl clutched her grandmother's hand wearing a bracelet shaped like a dove. A former public school teacher held a sign, "I wore my faith in silence, thank you for speaking." The moment swelled when a local pastor led the crowd in the Lord's Prayer, not as protest, but as gratitude. No one was fined, no one was warned. For the first time in years, Liberty Park lived up to its name. Karoline closed her speech with a promise. "This isn't the end," she said. "This is the foundation. And if they ever try to silence you again wherever you are, I want you to remember something. Justice isn't a robe. It's a voice, and you have one." The crowd stood, not with chants but with reverent applause, not for a politician, but for a principle. That night, drone footage of Liberty Park lit by handheld candles and soft hymns went viral. Over 4 million views in 24 hours. The caption read, "The courtroom tried to quiet her, now the country's listening." From coast to coast, communities held candlelight gatherings in solidarity. Governors in Texas, Florida, and Ohio cited Karoline's case in new bills protecting religious expression in public institutions. Veterans halls across the Midwest printed her speech and framed it. And in Liberty Park, long after the microphones were packed away and the sun had set, one sign remained taped to the podium. It read in simple script, "Faith didn't retreat, it rose." The verdict may have ended the trial, but it marked the beginning of something far larger. In the weeks that followed, Karoline Leavitt became more than a plaintiff or a press secretary. She became a catalyst. Liberty Park's candlelight vigil sparked a wave of reform that swept across the nation. Texas passed a bill safeguarding religious expression in courtrooms. Florida mandated First Amendment training for all state judges. Ohio introduced legislation to protect students and public servants from religious discrimination. Each one cited Leavitt v. Coulter as precedent. In Washington, Karoline accepted a new role as special advisor on religious freedom to the Department of Justice, not for prestige, but to build a firewall between politics and faith. At the Liberty Court complex, a plaque was mounted outside the courtroom doors, in honor of those who stood for their rights when others tried to silence them. Letters poured in, thousands of them. One stood out. It was from a mother in rural Tennessee. "My son was told to remove his prayer bracelet at school, but after your case, he wore it again, with pride. Thank you for being the voice we couldn't raise." Karoline read it twice, then pinned it beside her desk. She knew the work wasn't done. She knew the system wasn't perfect. But she also knew this. Faith had found its footing again, and the gavel that once tried to silence it had instead become the spark of revival. The robes had fallen, the system was changing, and with quiet resolve, Karoline Leavitt stepped forward once more into a future that now belonged not to silence, but to the voice of the people. The fight for justice had not ended. It had only just begun. The story of Leavitt v. Coulter is a powerful reminder that courage, when grounded in principle, can shift the course of institutions. At its heart, this was never just about a $500 0-cent fine or even an $800 million zero-cents lawsuit. It was about who gets to speak in public spaces and whether faith still has a rightful place in civic life. Karoline Leavitt taught us that silence in the face of injustice isn't humility, it's surrender. And sometimes the most meaningful battles are fought not with fists or slogans, but with truth, patience, and unwavering resolve. We learn that systems, no matter how entrenched, are not beyond accountability, that a single person, if willing to stand firm, can uncover years of buried bias and force change that benefits millions. From courtroom testimonies to candlelit vigils, this movement showed that justice is not passive, it must be pursued. And perhaps most importantly, we were reminded that symbols matter. A cross, a prayer pin, a quiet act of defiance, they are more than accessories, they are declarations. In a world that often asks us to compromise for comfort, Karoline Leavitt's journey shows us the price and the power of standing for what we believe in.